Okay, here's the next episode, and hopefully this won't be too boring, but this will be a cost breakdown with my spreadsheet. And just real quick, I've kind of tried to categorize things, and I've done kind of a sum of different items kind of collected together. So I'll kind of go through um, in clusters here. I've got two tabs here. I've got one without the cam swap. So this tab is basically going to be the minimum pretty much required to do the V8 swap with no other mods. And there is going to be cheaper things than what comes up here because there are some things I'll kind of go over as far as items where cost can be cut, things can be obtained a little bit cheaper, and I'll kind of go over those as I go to those categories. But for those that don't want to watch the whole video of me discussing this, I will just go straight to the bottom right off the bat. And so, mind you, this is just parts. I did not include shipping. Some instances where I paid tax, I think that's included as well. But this is basically no shipping. And that was my total cost without the cam to do the swap. So this would be the minimum if you mimicked every single part that I bought. There may be some variations, especially now due to COVID. I've noticed. I was looking up for instance, the oil pan that I ordered is actually like $120 more now. So some of these prices may not be the same. I mean, it's been over the course of the last year that I've bought these items. So some of these things have probably gone up. I did track a couple tools that I needed, but I'll kind of go over that at the end. But that is the kind of minimum cost. We'll say plus or minus, we'll say 2,000. You know, there's probably some things that you can cut pricing on that get that down a couple thousand, and I'll kind of go over that. And then I will show this is what I spent. So this is including the cam swap, a couple other mods which I'll kind of talk about that I opted to go with that you don't necessarily have to go with. I don't think that's that much more, especially for the performance gains and the reliability gains of the cam swap. For those not familiar with the Gen 5 LTs, they do have lifter issues because of the DoD AFM system. So that's the displacement on demand active fuel management. So that's basically cutting the engine from 8 cylinders to 4 cylinders for fuel economy. The best way to get rid of that system, which is pretty much from my research has been the system that fails the most with the Gen 5 LTs, is to swap the cam. So I went with a stage 1 high lift. It allowed me to retain the factory converter so I didn't have to go high stall, which also allows me to keep the power band lower than if I went crazy with a bigger cam, bigger stall. That starts to move the power band kind of higher up. And since I off-road, I really didn't want to do that. So I thought this was a good trade-off. Allowed me to delete the DoD AFM system and therefore helping the reliability and longevity of this motor. So let's go ahead and start with the no cam swap. So for both, this was my cost for, I'm going to mainly hit on this actual cost column. I was doing the spreadsheet and looking up some prices. I did get a couple discounts for some, I was in the military, so I got a couple veteran discounts. So I'll kind of discuss that along the way as well. So I got the engine, transmission, and transfer case from Engine Swap Supply, and it cost me $46.20 shipped to my door. So I bought it around Black Friday in November. They had a special where they did free shipping. So that was their cost. I didn't have to pay shipping, and so that was the final cost shipped to my door. I don't know if their prices have gone up. I know that there's starting to be a lack of Gen 5 LT motors. I'm in a swap group, and there's a lot of people that are having trouble finding engines, transmissions. Transfer cases are pretty readily available. A lot of people switch to two-wheel drive, so those pop up a lot. But that was the pretty much drivetrain cost, and it also came with an ECM and TCM, but I'll discuss some of that later. I'm including this L86 intake manifold throttle body with gaskets in here because if you opt to use the Volent intake, which is a bolt-in solution, I should say not necessarily a bolt-in, but a mildly modded solution, you would have to upgrade your intake manifold from the 5.3 to the 6.2, which is the L86. This is an area where you can cut cost. So if you want to keep the 5.3 intake, my motor came with the intake manifold. If you keep that intake manifold, you can eliminate this cost and you can fabricate probably a cheaper intake than buying this off the shelf. I wanted kind of a clean stock look that didn't really look like things were fabbed under the hood. So I also wanted a little bit more power, which the L86 intake manifold and throttle body give you. We all know more air in the engine, more power. So I decided I was doing this as an upgrade anyways. And it just so happens that when I was doing some measurements and some looking into intakes, I ended up finding out this Volent intake worked with this setup. So that was kind of the total cost of that, $250, $650. I believe that's this column, which is the same, but all of these totals are actually from my actual spent column. The next kind of section is tuning. This may vary based on if you are taking it someplace to get it tuned, or if you're doing the tuning yourself, or if you're tuning with a remote tuner. So I am tuning with a remote tuner. I did not include his price because obviously that's going to fluctuate depending on who you get to tune. But if you're remote tuning, this is kind of the minimum cost. So my tuner uses HP tuners, so I had to buy the HP tuners MVI, which is the thing that plugs into the OBD to be able to hook it up to a laptop. That was this $269, which I got a veteran discount on this. And then I had to buy 4 credits, which I've laid out over here. 4 credits for the E92 ECM, which is the Silverado ECM that I'm running. And then I had to unlock the TCM. So I had to send a TCM to HP Tuners. The 8L90 uses the T86A, which I have listed here. That is also, it's the same TCM as in the Colorado, so it mounts the same. I just don't know if the programming would be the same. This T86, I'm sorry, the T87A that I sent is actually the one from the Silverado. So I sent that. I had them unlock it. That service was $300, $299.99, and then you also have to buy 4 credits to actually unlock the tuning capabilities in the software, which was another. So tuning is quite a bit. This is just basically to begin the tuning process. Then you still also have whatever your tuner's charging you. So this may be an area where corners can be Not necessarily corners can be cut, but depending on who you're getting to tune it, if you just take it somewhere and you just say, hey, throw this thing on a dyno and you tune it, they may eliminate all this cost because they're going to use whatever they use to tune it, and then they're going to basically return it with the tune, but you're with that tune. Like, you can't obviously modify it because you don't have the hardware. So that's an area where this cost can fluctuate depending on what exactly you're doing and how you want to tune it. All right, this area, so the programming, I kind of call this just programming, but this is actually the hardware and the subscription to be able to program the ECM to the vehicle. So basically what you have to do is, and I'll cover this in another video once I kind of finalize this. A lot of this is still, I haven't fully integrated the Silverado ECM into the Colorado. I've got it to work and start, but I'm still working on getting it to be fully integrated, everything working like stock. So this is kind of your cost if you're doing that yourself. So you need an MDI2 programmer, which is the actual GM dealership tool. I bought that from this OBD2 tool. It's a Chinese knockoff. I mean, you're buying it straight from China. It looks exactly like the factory one. The website looks a little sketchy because it is a Chinese website, but I ordered it, had no problems. They sent it to me. It's been working fine. I've already done some programming with it. To do programming, you're going to have to go to acdelcotds.com, which is basically the dealership website where they do all their diagnostics. It allows you to do any of the programming. You have to buy a subscription. It's a 2-year subscription. It's $40 per VIN. Because you are using both the Colorado and the Silverado, you will have to buy it for both VINs. So whatever VIN you obtain for your ECM, you can determine that with HP tuners. You would use that to register that VIN, and then you would also register the Colorado, whatever your Colorado VIN is. That way you can program the ECM using the Silverado VIN, and then once you get it programmed, you go in through the Colorado VIN to actually pair that ECM with the rest of the Colorado, so everything works fine. I'll go into that a little bit more detail in a future video, but that is the cost. All right, now the rest of this, there's a lot of bolts and such in here because I ran the Camaro Accessories because it mimicked really close to the Colorado V6 accessory locations, and I wanted to kind of keep it similar. This is also what Current Performance did on their 5.3 build, so I decided to just kind of mimic that. Some of this stuff, so everything here was from GM. They're all GM parts except for one bolt for the AC compressor. This bolt, the GM parts catalog is incorrect. So I have this note here that I ordered a bolt with the proper thread and length, and then that's the actual bolt I ordered from Amazon. It was actually a package. I think I've got like 3 bolts. It's the M8 by 1.25 by 80 millimeter, and it's a class 10.9, which is kind of overkill. It's just holding the one part of the alternator, or I'm sorry, the AC condenser on, compressor on, sorry. I did cut a little corners here and didn't order a factory GM AC compressor. They're pretty pricey, so I ordered an aftermarket from Rock Auto. I don't remember the brand offhand, but that was probably the only non-GM part that I ordered for at least this section. The alternator for the 5.3 is the same as it'll work on the Camaro Accessories. So I didn't have to buy an alternator. The alternator is the one that came with the motor. So there's no cost for that. And then the total cost to run the Camaro Accessories reusing the alternator from the motor was this $812.47. One quick thing, this World Parts Direct is one of them kind of GM websites with the cheap parts where everything looks cheap, but they get you on the shipping. So some of the shipping was a little excessive. One of the issues I have with them is there's obviously multiple additional parts that I've ordered that didn't work. I had to do a lot of order something, try it out. If it didn't work, then I either returned it or I was SOL. World Parts Direct is one of those sites where if you order it, you are stuck with it. This bolt that was incorrect in the catalog, they would not return, even though it was incorrect in the catalog. I even verified that at a dealership. I tried ordering it from a dealership. It was still incorrect. I had to order a insulator for the valve cover. It's basically the piece of plastic trim piece. The one that came with the motor was broken. I didn't include that price in here because that's all going to vary on the motor that you get. But I ordered one from them, and the catalog listed it for a 5.3, and it actually was the V6 one. So the part number was wrong. They would not return that as well. So I'm not necessarily going to recommend World Parts Direct, but these numbers here are the GM part numbers if it's listed as a World Parts Direct or any of these first choice GM parts. And I believe there's another GM website I ordered stuff from. But yeah, so here's the kind of layout of everything needed to run the Camaro Accessories. Some of the stuff, so the water pump, if you order the GM water pump, this is the GM part number. I did order it from Rock Auto. It's for a 2016 Camaro. This actually came with all the bolts, so I didn't have to order any fasteners for this water pump. It had all the bolts came with it, so that was really nice to find. I didn't have to sit there and try to search all the part numbers. One of the things when you run the Camaro Accessories, so the Camaro has a 6.2 in it. The 6.2 Camaro engine has a oil cooler that coolant flows through on the side of the oil pan. So there is a hard line that goes off of the water pump down across the back of the motor along the oil pan and hooks into the oil cooler. That line outlet is on the water pump. So this water pump cap is a block off. It's got an O-ring in it. It clips in there. It basically plugs that port to allow you to run that water pump without the oil cooler port, which in my instance I didn't need. So that is the part for that, the part number. I actually found it on walmart.com for a pretty reasonable price, so that wasn't too bad. So that's what this part is. When you run the Camaro Accessories, the Silverado motor has a triple pulleyed harmonic balancer or a crank pulley. I totally spelled balancer wrong. Let me fix that because I will be posting this in the comment on a Google Doc. So that way everyone can have that. So the crank pulley is got three belts on it. It has a vacuum pump belt, a AC belt, and then a alternator water pump belt. So the Camaro Accessories are nice because it actually shortens that up, and it's only two belts. You have an AC belt, and then you have the water pump alternator belt. Um, that's another reason why I kind of liked going with the Camaro Accessories. It gave me a lot more room in front of the engine because it was a lot more compact going to that two belt system. It also allowed me to eliminate the vacuum pump. So if you decide to run the Silverado Accessories, which would cut this, it would cut this cost out. So you wouldn't have to pay this cost at all. You would still have all your accessories, but it would increase some cost when you ran your AC lines because the AC compressor is on the opposite side. So you'd have to run longer lines. You'd have to route those. You already have to. The nice thing about the Camaro Accessories is I was able to run the alternator wire that comes on the Colorado V6. So if you kept this, you may have to build your own alternator cable. I didn't even try it, so I don't even know if it would run, but it probably would work. But that's another thing that you've got to consider. But another big thing is you can eliminate the vacuum pump. So the Silverado has a vacuum pump that sits at looking at the front of the engine. It would sit at the bottom right. I believe you could probably just take the belt off, but you would have to. I'm not entirely too sure. I know it's a vacuum pump, it's belt driven, but oil runs through it. So it cycles oil, which means that I don't think you can just take it off and leave it off. If you do, you would have to run these vacuum pump plugs, which I had to run because the AC compressor goes there. This is a GM part because the Camaro actually has those plugged. You need two of them because there's an inlet and an outlet. But if you were to not run that, I'm thinking you could probably just take the pump off, throw these plugs in, and be fine, and you would just have a belt pulley on the crank pulley that's just not being used, and you would be fine. But I never ran it like that, so don't entirely quote me on that. So continuing on, these are just kind of little miscellaneous things. Obviously, you're going to need engine mounts. So these are from Current. I bought them from Current Performance. They're the only ones I know of that sell engine mounts for the Colorado to mount a Gen 5 LT motor. The Gen 5 LT motors are all the same mount, so if you decide to run a 6.2, same mounts. These connect to your existing engine mounts. So when you pull the motor out, you have to take the engine mounts off, take off the brackets that attach the engine mount to the engine, and then you would replace them with these brackets and then hook them to the Gen 5 LT motor. I did not put in here, I ended up buying new engine mounts just because they weren't that expensive, and I felt more comfortable just going back with the new. My V6 engine only had 30,000 miles on it, so I'm sure the engine mounts were still good. But just so I can get everything in there clean, new, I just bought new engine mounts, but I didn't include that cost in here because it's not required. All right, moving on. I wrapped the engine mount. There's a little boot thing that kind of goes over the actual mount, the mount part with the actual rubber that kind of takes those isolates those vibrations and everything from the frame. There's kind of a plastic piece that kind of protects that. Because I knew the exhaust was kind of going to run pretty close to that, I should say the manifold of the exhaust, I decided to wrap them with a foil face thermal kind of adhesive barrier. And that's the part number. A pretty big sheet of it was this $18, and it ended up doing both mounts. All right, so now we're kind of getting into a couple of the little things. So this $12 is the Peak skid plate washers. Peak sells skid plate washers. If you run a diff drop and you have your engine skid plate, that's the one behind the front. You need to lower that to run a diff drop because the diff will basically touch that skid plate. So I had the idea I needed a little bit more clearance for the drive shaft, and I wanted the angle of the engine and transmission to be a little less than what it was when I initially installed it. And so I came up with this idea that if I move the transmission mount up just a tad, it would allow me to clear a front drive shaft better without hacking up the mount or the cross member, and it would give me a better angle. So I ended up buying a set of the Peak skid plate washers and drilled out the hole bigger so that the bolts for the transmission mount fit, and was able to basically get a way better angle, and I can clear the custom drive shaft I bought no problem, and did not have to notch the cross member, which from my research had to be done on the LT4 swap, and I really didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be cutting up cross braces and modifying them. So that little bit of space that washer gave me was perfect. So that's the cost for that. That's why I've included it on the spreadsheet. I mean, you could get away with saving $12, but you are probably going to have to do some cutting of the cross member and some welding. In my instance, I'd rather pay the $12. Okay, here's kind of a big expense where there could be some money saved here. So this is basically my entire oil setup. So I had to buy, well, I shouldn't say I had to. I bought a hot rod oil pan from this MR Muscle Rods. This is their website. This is the part number. They sell two different oil pans. This part number will clear the front diff with no cutting, like no mods. You can throw this oil pan in there and it will clear everything. If you have a two-wheel drive that you're swapping, you could get away with a cheaper oil pan that doesn't need any modification. If you have a four-wheel drive, you can get a Holley oil pan that you have to cut up and re-weld back together to clearance the front diff. That oil pan was back ordered when I initially started this, and trying to find an aluminum welder that could weld it, basically make sure it's sealed because it is holding the oil, and do it for a reasonable price was just getting really hard to find. So I got some dimensions and opted to go this route. Yes, it's probably a little bit more pricey, but if you're doing the swap and you know someone that can aluminum weld, you can cut this probably in half. Actually, probably a little bit more than half. I didn't have that luxury. I don't know it. I know some aluminum welders, but they're not local to me. And so I opted to go this route. Now, with that said, running this oil pan, I did have to relocate the oil filter. It did not work with the front diff. It ends up placing the oil filter basically right into where the front pinion of the front diff is. So I ended up running an oil relocation bracket that was from Canton Racing. You could probably get away with all of this being a lot cheaper by buying an oil filter relocation kit. I know there's ones out there that are a lot cheaper than this, but I wasn't a big fan of kind of the cast pieces that come in those kits, and I wanted to go. I don't intend on selling this thing. I intend on off-roading it, driving it like I drove it before. And so I kind of wanted a little bit of a higher tier of stuff. So these are all milled aluminum. They're not cast. I also read a lot of reviews on those cast ones. Sometimes they don't seal very well. And every review I read said that if they had a cast one that was bad, they ended up just going with an actual milled piece. And so I just went with that right off the bat. So this was my oil relocation bracket. That's the one that I'm running up by the sway bar that holds the mounts the oil filter. This is the bypass. So for the bypass with this oil pan, you have to have one that goes straight down. A lot of bypasses, it comes out the side. If it comes out the side, it's going to hit the diff. You cannot run one that comes out the side. This was the only one I could find that fit an LT oil filter thread pattern, which is this M22 by 1.5, and went straight down. It had really good reviews. It's finned. I have a video on it. I think it was about 2 videos ago where I kind of show this a little up close. But that's it. That's the part number of the one I ordered. I think they might have some other colors if you want to do some other colors that might have a different part number. But got that on Amazon. I had to buy, these are the NPT. I think I said NPF because I thought it was fitting, but I think it's thread. It's National Pipe Thread, I believe is what NPT stands for. But the half-inch NPT is basically what the relocation bracket and the bypass, that's what the thread is. So I had to buy an adapter to go from that thread to the AN so I can run AN lines. I did buy 4 of them. That was the price. There's the part number. There's 2 in the bypass, 2 in the relocation. And then this is the extender. I didn't know the exact brand, so they're Earl's 10 to 10 male extender. That was so that I can run 90-degree AN fittings. That way the AN line would basically go straight across underneath the oil pan to go up to the actual oil filter relocation. I initially was playing with 45, so I could go 45 right out of the adapters, but I didn't like how it was bending the AN line, and I didn't want them to come close to the skid plate, which they would have done. So that's why I did the extender. Then I ended up being able to do the 90 degrees, and then everything has some nice clearance. It's tucked high enough that the skid plate, if the skid plate bends up, it's going to have to bend up pretty far to actually hit any of these lines. So these are the AN, this is all the AN stuff. I had 2 straight 290s. That makes up the oil system. There's the price for each. I bought them from this Hot Rod Fuel Hose. They're PTFE. Everything that Hot Rod Fuel Hose sells is PTFE. So I kept everything with that same brand. I hear there's a lot of fluctuations between AN stuff. You know, some companies' fittings fit different than other companies, so I decided I'll stick with this Hot Rod Fuel Hose and just order everything from them. They also have a discount code if you float around, and you can usually get their stuff for 10% off. I believe the one I was using was like SEMA 10 because it was around SEMA going on and they still had the discount code going. I bought 20 foot. I didn't use all of that 20 foot. I bought that because initially I was going to integrate the oil cooler, and I ended up not doing that. So you could probably get away with a lot less than 20 foot, which would drive this cost down considerable. All right, so here's my exhaust. So my total exhaust was 945.68. That is just parts. No labor involved in that. These are all the parts that I bought. I decided to do V-bands. I did 2.5 V-bands because, as you can see in my older videos, I have a center section that you can remove off the Y-pipe to access the transmission pan without having to drop the whole exhaust or the whole front section. You could just drop that section, access the trans pan, put that section back in. And then the 3-inch is between my Y pipe and the catback. So I bought this tubing set from Amazon. It's 2.5-inch stainless. And I bought another set of 3-inch. That was the cost at the time. This cost probably has gone up. It seems like a lot of exhaust stuff or anything metal has gone up in price. I bought a flex pipe. The factory one had a flex pipe. It's good to have one for any type of movement, so I put one in there. This is the initial muffler that I bought. I have an X-Mod MagnaFlow, which I'll probably be removing this one and putting it in there. This is the Y pipe, which is basically just a Y fitting. This is actually, so I custom bent all my hangers. I only used 4 of these, so this price is actually a little high. That's because I bought 6 at $10, but I only used 4, so this is probably more in the range of $42, $43, not the 62. And then, I mean, this was about the only rod I can really find. It was kind of a pain to bend. It was solid rod. I probably could have got some hollow stainless rod, and it probably would have been cheaper. But I have a press, or not a press, but a press, and I kind of used that to bend this and was able to make it work. This obviously is not something that you're gonna just grab and bend. This was the bung set that I bought for the O2 sensors. It was a 4-pack. I only used 2 because the Catalytic Converters that I bought, which this is the brand and part, they had 2 O2s built into them already. So I'll be using those as the downstream. These cats are actually EPA certified, but not CARB. So they came with EPA cards and everything. I'm hoping this gets me by because I do have to get this thing inspected annually for emissions. We'll see how that goes. I still am not entirely sure how that's going to go, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But I did want to run, catalytic converters that are EPA certified will get me to where I could say, hey, look, I have legit catalytic converters. These are also nice and tight and small packaging, so they were able to kind of clear around the front drive shaft, which is probably the tightest area as far as the exhaust is concerned. I bought all 4 brand new O2 sensors. The engine didn't come with an exhaust. It just came with the manifold. That was it. I am running a wideband. I did not include this price into this because this will vary based on your tuner. My tuner, since I'm doing remote tuning, he wants air-fuel ratio and lambda. It's requiring me to run a wideband. So I actually have 5 O2 sensors that are welded into my piping. So I will be running 5 O2 sensors, one of them being a wideband, and I'll have an air-fuel ratio gauge, and I can pull that data into HP tuners as I'm tuning. I did go with Holley Hooker Blackheart LT swap manifolds. They sit really tight to the block, which is why I kind of had to do some funky angles to get it to clear the front diff and drive shaft. I showed that in one of the videos, probably a couple videos. I did have to buy just the standard cast uncoated ones. So this is actually probably the cheapest ones you can get. They do have coated ones that are more money, but I made this note here that at the time that I bought them, they were 2 months back ordered. So I coated them with some exhaust coating, which is why they are orange in my videos. But yeah, I mean, I just went ahead and did that to give it a little bit of coating. I'm just trying to minimize the rust. I mean, I live in the South, so I don't expect them to rust too bad, but I do, they probably will rust. They are going to get wet and probably muddy. Because I ran that, I decided to go with some ARP header bolts, just because they won't rust and they are designed to be reused and shouldn't basically get to the point where if I ever have to do any work and pull these headers off, they won't break, which is common. The factory ones will rust, and if you try to pull manifolds, sometimes you will break the bolts and they'll be stuck in the heads, and you got to deal with that. I do not want to deal with that, so I went with that. It's only $35. It's not that big of a deal, especially with considering the full cost. I included this price in here. I put a new condenser in because the one that was in mine was basically caked with mud, really, really bad. You will need a drier decadent material. It's basically, if you ever see your condenser, there's a tube on the side, there's a nut on the bottom of it, and that's kind of like your decadent material, which is basically what pulls the moisture out of the AC system and out of the Freon and everything. If you open up the AC system, which you will be doing when you pull the motor, you should be replacing that when you put the system back together and seal it up. Because mine was caked and I already had to do the decadent material, I was like, I'll just buy the whole thing. It's not a GM one. It's this TYC brand, $70. I did it. The cost is included in the bottom total, but this could be a lot cheaper. The decadent material, I think, is only like 15 to 20 bucks. So here we go into some cooling stuff. So the upper radiator hose, this is the part number. Basically what I had to do is I kind of hodgepodged some piping together that I had laying around to kind of figure out the angle and everything that had to go from the top of the radiator to the thermostat housing off the water pump. So once I kind of got the overall shape of what it had to look like, I went up to Advanced Auto, and basically they let me go in the back, and I sat back there until I could find a molded section of pipe that would fit that same shape. And I came out with this part number, which we looked up, and is actually actually a lower hose for 2003 Chrysler Sebring with the 2.7 V6, and it's actually the middle of it. So that pipe is actually really long, and when you look at it, there's a section in the middle that's like the perfect shape. So you have to cut off each end and get it to this. I mean, it's $23. It's not too bad. But that's what I had to get to basically make the upper radiator hose one hose molded. Worked out pretty good. The next price, that's actually the lower radiator hose for a 2016 Camaro convertible. It has to be a convertible. So like I said, the 6.2 Camaro has a coolant flowing to the oil cooler. For the kind of pathway of that, it actually goes back into the lower radiator hose. The convertible, it does not. So with the convertible, it only has one coupler in the lower radiator hose, whereas the one with the coolant going into the oil cooler has multiple couplers. The Camaro convertible one pretty much fits perfect. It will go to the water pump, to the lower radiator hose of the Colorado. All you have to do is take the coupler off that has the return line and put in this part right here, the HPS 6-inch coolant hose coupler. So basically I pulled that that T put this in there, lower radiator hose was exact size. That takes care of the radiator hoses. So the heater core, okay, the hose coming off of the water pump, there's two outlets that go back to the heater core and to the overflow, or I should say it's expansion tank. Technically, it's not an overflow in our trucks, it's an expansion tank. So the lines coming off of the Camaro water pump are two different sizes. You have a 5/8 and a 3/4. So you end up having to run a small section of the 5/8 and then step it up to the 3/4. So this is the coupler to do that. And then these are actual molded 90 degrees. So the the water pump outlets point towards the passenger side of the truck. And if you use these lines, you can basically run it to where as soon as it leaves there, there's a molded 90 degree. My engine still had the fitting that kind of sits there with the little clamps to actually hold the two heater core hoses. I was able to utilize those and then go right back to the heater core. One of them goes to the heater core, the other one goes to the T from the expansion tank to the heater core, and it all fit perfect. I put them on the factory Colorado quick disconnect things with the actual little lock pins in there, and that was pretty much all that was needed. I probably should have done a coolant kind of total, but that's not really too bad. Let me, I'm going to go ahead and insert that in there. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm not going to put the AC condenser in there. Okay, so that was 128. $128.59 for all the cooling hoses. Not too bad with the couplers. That's also this steam line. So I ended up buying a new steam line. So you have one steam line that goes to the radiator and one steam line that goes, it pretty much plugs right into the thermostat housing. So the water pump comes with a thermostat. It's all kind of built in. There's a plastic piece that comes out that the thermostat sits in. That's where the upper radiator hose goes. And then there's a little nipple that sticks out for the steam line. So I routed the steam line with the radiator steam line so they kind of follow the same pathway. The Colorado, it kind of goes its own way around the intake and kind of goes to a different area of the engine towards the valley. For the LT, it's in the front, so I ran a line right next to the existing steam line that goes to the radiator, and that was about 20 bucks. I don't have a part number for that because I basically just took the hose up there and said, hey, give me 10 feet of this size hose that isn't molded. It's not molded, but it's a pretty big radius. You really don't need it to be molded anyways. I believe that was around 20 bucks. I don't even remember the full cost of it, but it wasn't that expensive, so I threw in 20 bucks. All right, so fuel lines. Fuel lines, I ran my engine came with the hard lines all the way down, basically next to the transmission transfer case. At that point, so basically right where it turns to a rubber line for the Silverado, I cut that off way down towards the transmission transfer case, and I used this is from that hot rod fuel hose. They have a hard line to AN adapter. I used one of those on each of those, and basically converts the 3/8 inch hard line to a -6 AN fitting, and then this hot rod EFI quick connect fitting 3/8 to 6 AN. That is pretty much a quick disconnect, but it threads. So if you ever seen the fuel lines that you stick on and you need the little special tool to go in there to kind of unlock the little plastic thing in there to pull the fuel hose off, it looks similar to that, except that instead of using the special tool, there's actually a piece that threads on there and locks it around that bevel that those fuel lines have. So if you buy 2 of these, they'll go on to the Colorado side. You screw them on there, tighten them down. That basically makes that quick connect turn into a -6 AN line. And then these are all the fittings and hoses that I used. One straight 190, 245s, and then about 6 foot. You won't use all 6 foot. It's a very, very short distance. But I bought 6 just to be safe. That's the total for the fuel setup. Not really a lot of money. It's running the factory Colorado fuel pump. Those that don't know, the factory V6 is direct injected. The V8 is direct injected. As long as you have a certain amount of pressure coming out of the fuel pump and flow, the high volume fuel pump, which is on the engine, it's the mechanically driven fuel pump, is what increases the pressure to go into the engine. So as long as you get the fuel up there, the high pressure fuel pump takes care of the rest, which is actually part of the engine. In our instance, you would only need to upgrade the in-tank fuel pump if you wanted big power. I'm estimating about 400 horsepower out of this setup that I'm doing with the cam and everything. That's not enough yet to be increasing in-tank fuel pumps. I don't know what the limit is of the Colorado one. I just know from the research I've done, I would have to be putting a lot more power down before I'm switching that out. If you go even higher than that, you may have to upgrade the high pressure, and then you would have to determine whether or not you're starving that to where you need the in-tank one upgraded. I shouldn't do that. I'm not worried about it. I'll find that out once we start doing the tuning, but from all my research, I shouldn't have to worry about that at all. I haven't added in the cost of all this stuff. I mean, that's all kind of just going to depend on what you run for coolant, oil, filter, Freon. The Freon I should probably put on here. This was about $150. Honeywell is the only company I could find that sold Freon for our trucks. So the Camaro Accessories, the Camaro AC compressor is also set up for R1234YF. That's what the Colorado, at least my year Colorado runs. It's the new coolant type. It does not run R134A, which means that the Freon is pretty expensive and there's not a lot of companies that make it yet. Honeywell was the only company I could find that actually had cans of it. You need an entirely different manifold setup because the high and low side attachments are different. The can thread is different, so you can't even use an R134 can setup, basically where you thread the valve into the can to actually release the Freon into the system through a manifold. I bought an adapter set, so I bought a setup that will basically I can run it on R134 manifold, but all the fittings now are different so that they could accommodate the R1234YF. But I found the Freon for $150 for 4 cans, which should be enough for 2 fills. I believe 2 cans will fill our system. It's like 500 and something grams, and a can should be about 300 grams. So I'll leave that on there. I'm trying to remember the website I bought it off of. I found a website that sold 4 packs for $150, which isn't too bad. I actually found it locally at Napa for about the same price. I'm trying to remember the exact price, but my local Napa actually had this Honeywell R1234YF in the cans. And then transmission fluid, that's all going to vary based on what you like to run. I'm running the Mobile Blue Label. The 8L90 has the same type of stuff as the 8L45 that's in the Colorado with the shutter. So I'm going to drain out whatever fluid's in there now, put in, a pan filter change, fill it back up with the Blue Label, run it for 500 miles, drain it, new filter, put another fresh Blue Label in it. I'm intending to just stick with what the manufacturer recommends. Oil and coolant, I'm running AMSOIL. I pay for their preferred thing because I run it in all my vehicles and my motorcycle, so I get it for a decent price. All right, let's go down to AC. So this is everything I bought for the AC conversion. Mind you, this is also keeping it on near the factory location, so there's not a lot of line and stuff that's required. So first off, I bought a seal set from Rock Auto. It was $8. It's every O-ring in the AC system. I took every line off except for the stuff underneath the dash, and every seal was replaced. That seal set was only $8. It's not that expensive, and it's just good assurance. So I kind of have this a little out of order, so we're going to jump down here to the swap conversion AC adapter. So this company, Hawk Motorsport, sells a lot of LS, LT swap stuff, and they actually have the swap conversion AC adapter. It's the LS2 version, the LSX LS2. This is the part number for it. They have multiple different ones, so you have to make sure you get the right one. What this is your port on your AC compressor, you're going to have a large one and a small one, so you're high and low. When you put this attachment in there, it will have those two lines coming out at a 90-degree angle. This one will give you the most clearance between that adapter and the frame of the truck. There is an LT version, but it'll end up, it's too tall and will actually hit the frame. The LS version actually flips it to where the two outlets will come to the forward part of the truck and will allow you to basically run this whole conversion that I'm going to kind of go over. And it'll be thread screw fittings, they're O-ringed. You can kind of position how you want, and I'll kind of go over what I did there. I think I have a video on it. I don't remember if I showed each individual component, but we'll kind of go over that. So this conversion adapter is going to have a 8. So AC hoses are sized a little weird. So they're just numbers. So there's like a number 8 hose, a number 10, a number 12. So the adapter will have a number 8 outlet and a number 10 outlet, but the factory large hose is actually a number 12. So you have to get this reducer. So this reducer will allow you to run a 10 line out of the adapter. Then you do the reducer flipped backwards, so you go from 10 to 12, and then you run a 12 line with the AC sleeve here, which is, they call them ferrules, but pretty much it's a sleeve. You put that on the factory fitting. You'd have to cut all the factory hoses. I might have to show a video kind of showing this a little bit better. I probably have one somewhere. It's been so long, I just don't remember which video it is. But basically you would need a crimper, an AC line crimper. Make sure it's an AC line. If you have a local shop that does hydraulic hoses, they can build you can basically size everything and take it to them if you don't want to buy an AC ferrule crimper. I bought one. It's just a hand pump one. I think it was maybe $100. But I work on a lot of stuff, so I figured it was just an investment for me. But that's why we kind of have these 3 different sizes here. So what I ended up doing is, since it goes out towards the front, the number 10 hose has to go back towards the firewall. So that's why I have the 180-degree fitting. And then the number 8 goes forward towards the AC condenser, which is why it's just a 45. And then in the number 8 line, you need to have this, it kind of looks like a T-fitting, but it's basically a straight section that gets crimped into that 8 line, or 8 hose, and then that's the pressure sensor. If you ever look at when you pull the motor out, the V6, you'll see the kind of hard line setup that you're kind of replacing with this setup. You'll see where the sensor and everything. This one here actually came with the sensor, the $70 one from BP Automotive. That's the part number. I put this little note, it gets crimped in with the 8 line so the sensor can be installed. That's part of the new wiring harness too. Current put that basically right there. So it just plugs right in. I think I have a video, probably shows it. Right now I just kind of have this thing zip tied to the vacuum pump mount, just to kind of keep it out of the way and from hitting anything. But yeah, this is kind of what you need. I bought 5 feet, 5 feet, 3 feet. You know, these were the prices per foot when I bought it. These ferrules are sold in packages of 6. I bought pretty much everything from Nostalgic AC. They have a lot of like hot rod, you know, custom AC stuff, so they're gonna have all these different fittings. Make sure you watch these part numbers, because there are some like kind of different types of fittings, different type, you know, they call them different things. But I have all the part numbers right here, so you can just mimic whatever I did. If you end up deciding to run the AC compressor on the other side, your fittings may be a little different, but depending on what you do, I'm not sure what the clearance is going to be with the adapter. You may be able to run the LT adapter. I don't know. That's going to be on you, but if you run the setup that I'm running, this will be pretty much what's required, and that's the 238. All right, let's move down. So transmission lines. So with the oil pan, you cannot run the hard lines all the way to the front like I initially wanted to do. The way the oil pan is, it kind of bumps out and puts a sump on that side to give you the 5 quarts. And because it does that, the hard lines will no longer clear. So the transmission hard lines I have cut not very far out of the transmission. You do have to run the hard lines, because I initially was going to run an adapter right at the outlet of the transmission, but it would hit the drive shaft. So you have to run the hard lines, because they basically do a direct 90. Once it kind of crosses over to the passenger side, that's where I cut them. Did the same thing as the fuel line, hard line to 6 -6 AN, and then ran my 245s to the -6 AN hose. And then at the cooler side, I kept the hard lines. Basically, right when they go to hard line to the rubber line, cut there, ran another set of hard line to 6-6 adapters, and then ran that AN back to the transmission. I had an issue with one of these hardline to -6 adapters where it was leaking. I replaced it. The hardline was a little janky when I did replace it. It doesn't seem to be leaking now. I've ran it a couple times. It was leaking pretty quick before when I was running it, so I'm going to keep my eye on that, but I may end up having to fix this again. I do have an extra one. I'm just kind of worried that I might have to actually buy another hard line, because if I go too far away, it's not going to line up like I have the AN lines already built. But we'll see what happens. This is actually the hydraulic, I believe this is the brand, the Safe Spiral Wrap Hose Protector. That is a hydraulic hose protector used in hydraulic fittings for like heavy equipment. I bought a pretty big spool of it. I don't remember the exact length of it, but it was $22.97, and I was able to do both oil lines and transmission lines, just as an extra protection for if they were ever to rub on anything. They do get close to some stuff. They shouldn't bounce around too much, because the AN lines, once you tighten them down, they do kind of stay pretty tight. But I ended up just doing this for added insurance. Let's see. All right, so this stuff here is actually all for vacuum. So I think I covered in a video, I adapted the vacuum pump bracket that is on the V6 to be able to run it on the L83. If you run the factory accessories and don't switch to the Colorado accessories, you may not be able to do this, and you may have to run the vacuum pump somewhere else. The vacuum pump may not be needed, but I'm running it just to be safe. So the reason why we have a vacuum pump, it's electric. It is designed to kick on and provide brake boost when your active fuel management displacement on demand is activated. So basically, when your engine cuts cylinders for fuel management, it will kick the vacuum pump on to pull vacuum, because your engine is not producing enough vacuum for the brake booster. Because I've deleted displacement on demand and active fuel management, I may not need this, but just to be safe, I am keeping it. I have it plumbed in. I have it ran to the basically the same similar setup as it was ran on the V6, but it's running through the V8. So the vacuum line that comes off of the crankcase, or I'm sorry, the valley that goes into the intake manifold is teed off. I do have a catch can in there, but that line is then ran and teed off into the vacuum pump and then over to the brake booster. I reused all the Colorado check valves. It is plumbed the exact same way as it is on the Colorado. If you ever pull that vacuum line out and look at it, the way I've ran it is the exact same. It's just plumbed into the L86 intake manifold hose instead of the V6. But this is all the kind of piping and fittings that I use to accomplish that. I also had to use some of the fittings from the existing one from the Colorado. So I had to cut off the brake booster fitting, cut off the vacuum pump fitting, and then I replaced it with this silicone vacuum hose. I believe I showed that in a video, but this was the cost of it all. Let's see. All right, here's a big one. So this is another spot where you may have a local drive shaft shop that can get you drive shafts for a lot cheaper. I wanted to upgrade to steel drive shafts, front and rear. The front was already steel, but I wanted a rear steel. The rear factory Colorado drive shaft it seems weird, but it is a tad too short. The 8L90 transfer case is actually shorter than the AL45 with the Colorado transfer case. The adapter housing between them is actually longer on the Colorado. So the tail of the transfer case is actually a little bit more to the rear on the Colorado than it is with the Silverado drivetrain in the Colorado. It's very surprising. I was not expecting that, but it ends up being to where the stock rear has too much reveal and is not enough into the slip yoke to really be okay. I mean, you could probably run it, but I did not want to risk it, and I wanted to steal one anyways. So I contacted a couple of drive shaft companies that I found online that I've heard about through off-roading communities. I probably reached out to about 4 of them. Adams was the only ones that replied to me. They replied to me within 24 hours, told me who I needed to talk to with them. I'm pretty sure his name was John. I'd have to look through some emails, but John was awesome. He probably the best company I've worked with involving any of this swap was Adams Drive Shaft. John replied to me within 24 hours of every email I sent him, sometimes sooner, but that was probably the longest, would be 24 hours. I told him what I was doing. Hey, I'm doing this swap. Not entirely sure what I'm going to need for the front because I have some clearance issues. How can you help me out? He sent me a slip yoke CV setup with a cardan joint and was like, if we do it this way, we can make that U joint tighter, probably clear it. He sent me one to test fit. I test fit it. Once I got the spacers in there that we talked about earlier, the peak spacers, worked perfect, plenty of clearance. Sent it back to him, said we're good. He told me all the dimensions that he needed. Once I gave him all the dimensions, the only thing he was worried about is he had no data on our front diff. It does run a flange. He had no data on the flange. So I sent him my stock front drive shaft and they machined an adapter. So they built me, I've shown it in a video, they built me an adapter, bolts onto the flange of the front diff, and then I've got a double cardan joint coming out of the transfer case with the slip joint, and then it goes into the flange adapter. High quality work. They give you lifetime warranty. If you go to their website, you can read about their warranty. Looks really good. Can't recommend them enough. Yes, it was pricey. As you can see, this was my total cost, front and rear, but because of all the work involved with the front and the adapter and the double cardan joint, that was the majority of the cost. I mean, $760 for just the front drive shaft. The rear obviously was very easy. Slip yoke, standard drive shaft. So that wasn't that expensive at all. The rear is probably cheaper than the GM Performance one. So I went with them for front and rear. Quality's top notch, and can't wait to run them. All right, so let's go on. So this is the Volant intake. It's actually for a 5.3 Colorado, the 2009. So it's actually a first gen Colorado intake. This is the cost. It works perfect. It's the perfect width to go from the throttle body to the fender. You've seen in my videos, all I did was drill a hole to be able to run a riv nut to secure the box down, and that's pretty much the only modification I did to it. I did cut the hole bigger and I did line it. That comes out the side. It didn't quite go into the fender and touch it as much as I wanted it to, but it's going to work perfect. You can run the mass airflow sensor from the Colorado. Just so you know, the Colorado and the Silverado is actually the same part number, so you don't have to buy it. I just took the one from the Colorado. It bolts right into this Volant intake, and you're good to go. Let's see what else. This split loom, okay. So this is actually my starter cable. So obviously the starter on the Colorado is on the driver's side of the engine, and the starter for the V8 is on the passenger side. So it's obviously a lot longer. So I ended up buying this pre-made cable on Amazon. It was 6 foot with 5/16 lugs. So it already had the lugs on each side. It was red. For $27, I figured, hey, that's not a bad price to get the lugs already on there. It ended up being the perfect length. There's like a little bit of slack, but not much. And I have that towards the battery side. And then I ended up covering it with this Alex Tech 20. I bought 25-foot half-inch split loom wire tube or wire loom tubing. So that's just the protection that goes over that starter cable. And then I also wrapped it with some heat protection tape when it gets close to the exhaust manifold, because the starter's like right there on the passenger side. That's kind of included in this miscellaneous cost at the end. And then finally, the wiring harness from Current. That's the cost of it. I paid a $50 extra for the nicer wrap. It's not like the plastic kind of loom protection, it's more taped protection. So if you don't opt for that, it would be the $9.75, but I opted for that because I think it looks better. Very clean harness. I haven't had any issues with it. Engine started right up. I'm still working out the kinks, but I haven't seen anything that makes me think there's anything wrong with the harness. And then, of course, I have this kind of $200 miscellaneous. So there is some hose clamps, some, heat tape, stuff like that. Some metal, I've got a couple things that I've just off the top of my head. Some metal for modifying the bracket for the vacuum pump. Let me spell that correctly. But I just kind of threw out this $200, probably a lot less than that, but just to kind of hopefully encompass the few things that I may have forgotten. But yeah, that comes up to this total $13,600. Obviously I've talked about a few places where you can easily cut that down. Obviously the oil pan, if you know someone that aluminum welds and can give you a good price, you could probably cut that. You can probably cut $600 to $800 off that right off the bat right there. You can use a different oil filter relocation. Well, if you did the oil pan, you wouldn't even need any of that. But you can use, you don't have to use PTFE if you have another source for AN lines. You can use, they have other lines that aren't as expensive. PTFE is probably the more expensive of AN lines. Basically, if you don't know what that is, it's got like a Teflon coating inside. It's E85 compliant, so if you ever decide, to modify the engine to be able to run E85, your fuel line is already able to accept it. I think that's pretty much it for the minimal cost. These were a few tools that I bought. Obviously, if you don't go into the engine, you're not going to need probably any of these tools. I need to take this off. This tool does not actually work, so we're going to cut that out. But I went into the engine, so being an LT Gen 5, LS stuff does not work. I didn't have a few things, so valve spring compressor, this is the LT one. LS ones don't work. I didn't have a harmonic balancer remover, so I had to buy that. The Gen 5 LTs, to do a cam swap, you have to pull the oil pump. And to pull the oil pump, you have to drop the oil pan, which is why if you're going to do a cam swap, it is a whole lot easier to do it before you install the engine than it does to do it later on. So if you plan on eventually doing a cam, You might want to look into doing it before you're doing the swap. That way you can do the cam swap before you put it in the truck. Once it's in the truck, it is not easy to swap the cam because of the oil pump placement in relation to the oil pan. When you pull the oil pump, you're supposed to have alignment tools to keep the oil pump aligned. I've heard people getting away with not doing it, but I've heard of people not doing it and the oil pump isn't aligned properly and they don't have enough oil pressure and the motor goes. For $40, I wanted the added assurance that it was going to be fine. So I bought that, and then I bought a flex plate lock because obviously with me replacing the crank pulley or harmonic balancer with the Camaro Accessories, I had to torque that bolt to spec, and it's like 250 foot-pounds. It's pretty drastic, and I did that on the engine stand. So I bought a flex plate lock so that I was able to do that. There's probably some other tools I bought, but this was back at the beginning when I was still kind of tracking that. Let's kind of hit on what I spent. So probably a majority of what I spent is my cam kit. So I bought my cam kit from GPI. It's their stage 1 high lift cam. I probably should put high lift because they do have a regular lift and a high lift. I did the high lift. I think it yields a little bit more power, but I didn't really research the difference. I went with the high lift because that's the one that I looked at first. But they gave me a veteran discount, so the prices on the left are what a typical person would pay, and the prices on the right are the military discount. I believe it was like 10% off or something like that. But you can pick and choose what you want in the kit. So I picked, the stage 1 high lift cam, and they tell you the price of each individual item within the kit. And then you can obviously adjust these based on your budget and what you want to do. I went with the Brian Tooley Racing dual spring kit with the titanium retainers. I did the hardened push rods. Depending on the cam you go with will depend on if you have to run a phase limiter and what phase limiter you have to run. So the Gen 5 LTs have variable valve timing. So the cam has a phaser gear on it. So based on how it's varying the timing, it will basically turn that gear to adjust the cam profile that's what variable valve timing is, in case you didn't know. That is a spring. It's basically a large spring in there. There's a specific way you have to install it. When you if you have to do a limiter, there's a specific process you have to go through to install that, because if you take the wrong bolt out, you unwind that spring and it's done. You have to buy a new limiter. That gear is pretty much useless, and hopefully it doesn't launch in your garage and damage anything or you. So if you do this yourself, make sure you watch plenty of videos on how to do this if you are required to and you're doing a cam. It wasn't too bad. I watched probably 15 videos just to make sure I was going to do it right. This was the first time I messed with anything with variable valve timing that had a setup like this. I've messed with VTEC before with balancer cams and stuff, but nothing like this type of a setup, at least at the time I did this. And then of course I went with the Chevy Performance lifters. I believe these are the LS7 lifters. Do a little bit of research on that because there are knockoff LS7 lifters. I think I think these are the Cadillac lifters. There's a couple different lifter options. I just can't remember the exact ones I went with. I believe that's how they label them, but you have to make sure they have the Chevy logo printed on them. There are some knockoffs floating around. GPI is pretty good. They're probably checking that before they even send it to you, but definitely double check that. Do a little bit of research on what to look for to make sure you're not getting knockoffs if you end up opting with someone else. I did stock head gaskets. They have options for that. I did the ARP bolt kit. I did not do the studs, the stud nut kit. It was a lot more money. I don't intend to take the thing apart again, so I just opted for the bolt kit. The regular standard lifter trays. The kit came with a new cam bolt, new crank bolt. You should replace those anytime you take them off. I did this fast fish timing cover seal, so that's basically your front main seal. If you do when you do the cam, you're going to do a DoD AFM delete. You have to block off the valley plugs. So when you take the valley cover off of the engine, which is the cover within the V, there will be there will be ports there where the oil comes in, and that's what it'll go into the actual valley cover. We'll have a whole entire system in there that's actually when it sends oil up into there to actually cut those lifters off to actually delete, or not delete, but to turn off those 4 cylinders. For it to work properly, you have to block those ports off. And I do list it as this AFM DoD delete. So you have to buy some type of a block off kit. Some big time engine builders, they'll just weld those things shut. But if you buy this kit, they'll have these block off options. I believe this is probably the only option, but they're very easy to install. It's just a plug you push into there and you tap it with a hammer until it seats, and then you're blocked off. Depending on your cam, you may have to do a fuel pump lash cap. Basically what this is your cam will probably have some type of an adjustment to the fuel lobe. This is for the high pressure fuel pump. It's mechanically driven off the cam. So depending on how they cut that for the additional fuel, you may have to do a lash cap, which is basically just a cap that gets pushed onto the can or the fuel pump lifter, and will basically, it's almost like a shim to make up that difference of however they ground it to actually give you the percentage of fuel increase that cam is giving you. So yeah, that came with the kit, and then it came with the sealant, and then I did a trunnion upgrade. For those not familiar, what the trunnion is when you have your I'm drawing a blank now. The lifter goes to the push rod, which hits the rocker. I'm drawing a blank. So the rocker, the factory rocker, actually is a semicircle, so that as it rocks back and forth, it is limited based on that semicircle. So there is a spot that it can extend and a spot that it can close to before it hits the flat edge of that semicircle when it's actually functioning. Since I went to a high lift cam, there is a chance that, GPI is pretty good at getting it all set up and telling you what's going to work and what's not going to work. But it would be very close to where I would be very, very close to maxing that half circle out. And so I decided to opt for the CHE trunnion kit. I forget what CHE stands for. It's seemed like a pretty good kit. It's all bronze bushings. It removes the bearings. So instead of the rocker having bearings, it actually has bushings. And so you basically press out all the bearings from the rockers, and then you put on this trunnion kit. It no longer has the semicircle. It is a bushing, and the rocker can spin 365 degrees. There's no limit. So if you go really crazy later on and I want to throw a stage 5 high lift cam on there and just lope the hell out of this thing, I will already be upgraded. I'll be able to max that rocker out. I won't max the rocker out, but I decided to go with that. I read good things, had good reviews, so that was another thing I did with the kit. But obviously, if you want to do some upgrades, this price would vary based on what kind of upgrades you do. Anytime you go into the motor, you are going to have to remove these fuel rails on the top of the motor that come off the high pressure fuel pump, and they say you should be replacing them if you remove them. I am going to say you should replace them if you remove them. One of them that I initially ordered was incorrect. I believe these are the correct part numbers. I'm pretty sure I fixed that. But one of them was incorrect, so I did not replace it, and it leaked. So it ended up leaking fuel, and I had to buy the correct one. When I tried to reuse it, it's almost like an AN type line, but it's like a ball going into a socket as you tighten it, and I guess it was just not put in the exact way that it was removed and sprayed fuel everywhere. I put a new one on, no problems. So I have that in with what I bought, because if you are doing the cam, these will have to be removed, so you might as well replace them. Okay, I do have my cost of tuning in here, so this is what I'm paying for my tuning. Let's see. This is all the same as before. I'm just looking for things that I did in addition to kind of the minimum. I believe that's probably the biggest thing. Yeah, I think that was the only thing, because I did initially have the intake stuff out of the without cam swap stuff, but because of me having to use the Volant intake, I decided to leave that in case someone opted for that. So I think that kind of covers everything. If anybody's got any specific questions, I hope I covered it pretty well. I mean, this is going to be a really long video. I hope I don't cause you guys to go to sleep, but that's why I kind of just did the cost at the beginning. That way you could see that, and then I went into a lot more of the meat and potatoes. If anybody else is more curious about specifics. But I'll go ahead and throw this onto a Google Doc, and I'll link that in the description. And if anybody has any questions, go ahead and throw them in the comments, and I'll answer them best as I can. If anybody sees anything in here that they don't remember seeing in a video and they'd like me to go a little bit more into detail with it, let me know. I will throw a video up of that. And like always, I'll see you on the next video.